Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. And the title of today's talk is Amonie's Anomie, Lost Symbols and Barbaric Affluence. Anime, a style of animation that was created in Japan and that uses colourful images, strong characters, and stories that have a lot of action. Anomie, in societies or individuals, a condition of instability resulting from a breakdown of standards and values, or from a lack of purpose or ideals. Encyclopedia Britannica. Well, hi everyone. So these are the questions I'm going to look at today rather than present any particular type of argument. I'd just rather ask some questions. So this notion of anomie as it's a sociological concept and it's a breakdown of standards and values or from a lack of purpose or ideals. And I'm going to ask, is this caused by a loss of I'm calling it a conversation with tradition, and by tradition I'm referring to the arts. And this notion of a conversation I'm borrowing directly from a guy called Michael Oakeshott, who I'll mention as we go along. But I think it's a lovely way of phrasing it, the idea that tradition is a conversation with the past. And the past as we experience it is obviously through history, but also through the arts that we inherit. And to what extent is a lot of modern issues, this loss of this breakdown of standards and values, which results in a lack of purpose or ideals. And to what extent, I'm asking throughout this video, is that a consequence of the way in which we've lost touch with the arts? And then anime, I am no expert in anime, as you'll soon find out. And for anyone who doesn't know much about it or not interested in it, I'd ask you just to bear with me, because I think it offers some interesting insights from a foreign culture like Japan into our own condition. And for those of you who are very familiar with anime and really, really like it, I'd also ask your indulgence, because I will be showing images from anime, but I'm not going to go into a huge amount of depth. Rather, I'm using it as I have done before. It's one of the methods I like to use a particular topic or theme as a launch pad to delve deeper into some of the ideas behind, rather than just the superficial level discussion of anime, to actually go behind some of the implications it might have. And then to draw these ideas together, this concept of the imaginary, which I'll explain very shortly, and barbaric affluence, which is a beautiful phrase that again I'm borrowing from Michael Oakeshott. So how I'm going to explore the imaginary is in the sense of how damaging is it to live with excessive images, abstract ideology, and a lack of practical symbols, and all those terms I'm going to define as we go along. Excessive images shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. We live in a media-saturated, image-drenched world. Abstract ideology, I'm going to try and draw together some links, because I think one of the reasons that we live in such ideologically driven times, driven and riven, is because of people's investment in quite abstract ideologies, rather than ideologies that draw from tradition and a sense of community. And that links to the concept of practical symbols. So practical, in the sense I'm using it in this video, isn't what's normally meant by the notion of practical. It has a sense of the normal connotation of practical, but it relates more to this notion of tradition and keeping in touch with the past. But like I said, I'll explain all these as we go along, so do indulge me. But this is a one anime. It was a manga as well, so it came in comic form, and it simultaneously almost, it was very quickly developed into an anime series. And this is called Sailor Moon. And it aired on Japanese TV from 1992 to 97. And the main protagonist in the middle starts off life as a 14-year-old in the series. And that's an issue I may explore in future, because from a Western perspective, this attention and presentation and depiction of scarcely, or even prepubescent girls, can strike people as quite disturbing. But I'm going to talk about it in this, as you can see just from the images, this idealization, the huge big eyes. There's no nuance to the shade. It's all very flat is a word I'll keep using because, and I'll present loads of images from traditional art to show you what I mean by flat, as opposed to the depth of the art that I'd advocate. So the way in which the colour and the lack of perspective and everything just hangs together, it's a very almost, well, it is two-dimensional, obviously. It's a two-dimensional flat image, but very, very little sense of depth. And sorry to go on about the eyes, but just this, everything's idealized to the nth degree. So that's going to be a key issue to look at. But this is from a anime series called March Comes In Like a Lion. And this is obviously much less schmaltzy. And it goes directly to the theme that I looked at in the previous video about the hikikomori, the shut-ins, the people who withdraw from society. And in this particular case, he's a shogi player, professional shogi player who's still at school. And shogi is a Japanese form of chess, which I'll show you in a second. But I just thought, as an illustration of anomie, that often has connotations, this breakdown of values and purpose. A lot of characters in anime, not always, but often, the theme of this social isolation is portrayed. And then this is Welcome to NHK. And NHK is the Japanese equivalent to the BBC. It's the Japan Broadcasting Corporation. And it's in the actual series, they play on that because it becomes, I think it's called Nippon Hoso Kyokai, which is the Japan Broadcasting Corporation. And in this series, it becomes Nihon Hikikomori Kyokai, the Japanese Hikikomori Association. So he becomes convinced that the Japanese Broadcasting Corporation is actually trying to gaslight people into becoming hikikomori. And the image, as you can see, is shut in his bedroom. Lots of portrayals of this isolation culminating in this type of image. So I don't think it's, I think it's clear that I'm not making this up. It obviously is a theme about almost like this existential loneliness. And I won't, for those not interested in anime, I won't bore you to death, but these are the type of images that, quite dramatically show you this concept of social isolation. I found this one interesting. This is from a series called No Game, No Life. And I think it's a brilliant image to summarize what I'm talking about in terms of anomie, because they're siblings, brother and sister. And I don't know whether you can make out, but he's got computer mice in his hands, but also his feet. So he couldn't be playing more games, and he's got a manic look in his face. And then his sister's curled in the fetal position, completely withdrawn from any interaction. I call it, they're just left, they don't have any parental supervision, so I call it domestic feral. So they're in almost like a state of the wild whilst never leaving the house, the apartment. And then this is, I just like the animation, the clarity with which it again portrays this frustration, this loneliness, and this is called Chaos Head, and it's chaos, semicolon, head. And then just to go back, I mentioned this Shogi, March Comes In Like a Lion. He's a Shogi player. And I think it's a way of introducing the concept of what anime arguably lacks in the way its aesthetic is presented. So it's a game, it's a variant of chess in a way, but compared to Western chess, I think personally it's more beautiful. It's having played a lot of Western chess, I also, back in the day, played a bit of Shogi. I found, because I was involved in the university network, I used to find Japanese exchange students who played Shogi. So you learn the kanji, the symbols on the pieces, and it's a beautiful game, and it's just like a lot of traditional Japanese culture. It's incredibly sophisticated, so even the way you move the pieces, you hold them between your fingers, and there's a very satisfying click when you put them down, but there's a correct way to pick them up and put them down. And then in the last three rows, there are there's like a promotion, it's like an end zone, and pieces that enter it can be turned over and promoted. So you'll see the piece that's just, and you can tell the pieces look exactly the same, but you can tell whose side they're on because like the lozenge shape, the pointy bit is going in the direction of play. And I actually have a board very like this. They're called Go bands, I think, and they for the game Go, but also for Shogi. And on the side, you can see there are these tall tables, and that's you take the opponent's pieces. And what's very unusual about Shogi, you put the pieces you've captured on the table, little table next to you, and they can then be reintroduced as your pieces as the game proceeds. And that's fascinating because it adds a whole, huge extra layer of complexity because these pieces can come in. But it also apparently stems from the history of the concept of Ronin, who were hired lancers, literally, but who were basically soldiers for hire in the way the Japanese fought. So it feeds into how the game was developed. It's perfectly natural in that historical setting that if you capture someone, they can then fight for you, and it's fed into the game. And why I'm showing you all this is that while you can see it in the anime, in actual person, these boards are absolutely stunningly beautiful if you get a good one. And it's all to do with the grain of the wood and how close to the centre of a tree it's cut. Because the closer to the centre of the tree, that will affect the grain. But obviously you can get many less boards if you cut close to the middle of the tree. And as I say, when you put the pieces down, there's a depending on the quality of the pieces and the quality of the goban, the board, it makes this beautiful sound. And that, like I say, there's the quality of the pieces, there's the lacquer that's used, there's the calligraphy and the skill with which it's engraved. It's just a stunningly beautiful game, and you get a sense. So this is in the anime one of the depictions, but you lose. I'm going to talk shortly, reintroduce the concept of aura, which I talked about in a previous video. This notion of being in a unique point in space and time. And what media obviously do is they are aura-less. Because media is based upon reproduction, these anime films are based upon making as many copies as you want and as many people seeing it on as many different screens as possible. You can have relatively pretty images like this, but they lack an aura. They don't have the grain of the original wood. They don't have the original sound. It's more difficult to recognize the skill of the calligraphy because these pieces, they're engraved, and then the engraving on the piece of wood is painted on. And all of these things that are unique to aura, a unique point in space and time, are lacking. And there's a whole tradition, so this would be, it's a beautiful depiction, but in the form of anime. So for all the reasons I've mentioned, I'm just using this because the March Comes In Like a Lion anime series was based, the main protagonist is a shogi player. But this is a different depiction from a different series where the traditional way of kneeling and playing the game and the beautiful silk print, paper print, dividing frames, just beautiful. But what I'm placing against all this is, even when anime is portraying traditional, because this is one of the aspects I'm going to talk about, traditional culture, anime is portraying it, but there's something automatically lost. And even though art is only representing what was a unique point in space and time, so the minute a painting is made, it's alluding to a unique point in space and time. That, for example, I'm going to show you a Monet painting in a second. Monet was at that unique point in space and time, trying to capture very specific light conditions. But the minute he puts it into a painting that lasts then for decades or centuries, that unique point in space and time has been captured. And what that means is you can experience seeing this painting, if you're lucky enough. This is at the Edinburgh National Gallery. And if you stand in front of it, I've chosen this because, paradoxically, I've chosen it because of its failure. You will not get from this image I'm showing you any remote sense of how stunningly beautiful it is face to face, which is always the sad thing about appreciating art, that no matter how good, the luxury reproduced book you've got, the huge, great, expensive art book, or no matter how good the resolution on your computer screen, there is just something you're not seeing. And in this particular painting that I've seen in Edinburgh, the only way I can describe it is the light jumps off the grain stack. It's called Grain Stack Snow Effect from 1891. And there's just this luminescence that comes off. There's no direct sunlight you can see in the painting, but it just emits this stunning glow. And to get that full effect, you need to be stood in front of that painting. And I was just absolutely gobsmacked, to use a technical art phrase, at how he'd managed, just with paint and oils and a canvas, to capture light almost. And then to make that light emit itself from the canvas in this weird, beautiful optical illusion. So just to go slightly deeper into the... So I'm starting off by, I'm just using a very specific example of an aesthetic in anime compared to a traditional painting to show you what I would argue is lost. So I've shown you previous anime pictures of the hikikomori, the shut-ins, and being in their own apartment and stuff. And then compare it to this. This is a painting called Solitude by Dela Yusmanov from 2015. And I'll leave it to you, but for me, the way in which the texture of the canvas has been used, the way in which the light pours across the person, that evokes more for me than any anime image ever could. And then this is Automap by Edward Hopper from 1927. And again, in terms of theme, I don't think that's a million miles away from some of the anime images I showed you. But what Hopper does with the darkness of the window, the reflective window, and the light receding off into the distance, there's a depth, and this is what I referred to earlier on, that is lacking in anime, the flatness of anime pictures. And again, I haven't seen this in person, but I am pretty sure that if I was, you'd be able to, obviously you could see the texture on the canvas and the way in which what seems like, so obviously this is black, but I think as you get closer you realize that the black is made up of the contrast, the dim lights, but also this hint of light within the dark. So it's not just flat, pure idealized blackness. There's a complexity even to the blackness. And this is called Man Seated by a Window by Alfred Jacob Miller from 1833. And again, I don't know how convincing I am to you, but I think this has some quality that anime just does not have. The imperfection, the fact it's not drawn with such clean, direct lines, the colours are much more muted and complex. And I find anime has a, and I'm just talking at the moment about the aesthetics, I'm quickly, don't worry, going to move on to some of the more conceptual issues. So I'm just talking at the moment about the relatively superficial aesthetic differences between anime and conventional art or traditional art. But this in turn, there's Harold Bloom has this notion, he calls it the anxiety of influence, the way in which artists are affected by previous artists. And on the one hand, they derive inspiration from them, but on the other, they're anxious to show their independence from them. So I'd suggest this was probably influenced by Rembrandt, and this is approximately 1631, entitled An Old Scholar Near a Window in a Vaulted Room. So I hope you can see just the use of colour and the light. And again, sorry to hammer home the point, but compared to the anime, the next image I'm going to show you, The Shoes, 1886, Vincent van Gogh. And I would always go back to this painting, and Martin Heidegger, the German philosopher, wrote about, it's unclear whether the specific painting, because Van Gogh did a series of paintings about peasant shoes. But this is, to me, emblematic of the depth of Van Gogh's subject matter. And even though this is just an old pair of boots, I'd suggest this could not be more different aesthetically to how anime appears. And like I say, shortly I'm going to discuss why that might matter or might not matter, but I'm just trying to overemphasize the aesthetic differences. You know, that song, these boots were made for walking, these boots were made for toiling. And just to start to bridge this issue of, well, what's the relevance of the aesthetics to the underlying meaning and conceptual depth? This screams out boots that have been lived in. This screams out peasants toiling in a field. The soil you can see on the outside, the mud caked on the outside of the boots, and the way in which the boots are of the same hue as the rest of the painting. The floor and the wall, it's just the way Van Gogh's done it. It all just merges into one, this amorphous brown colour from which the boots erupt. I'm just looking also, I'm trying to remember whether I've read somewhere that they both look like potentially left-footed boots as well. Sorry to have a touch of the tism about me, but I don't know what you think, and let me know in the comments, but they look both left. I'm sure I've read somewhere that was one of the anomalies in this painting, or the anachronisms, whatever the right word is. They both look like left feet boots. But what does, obviously it's maybe not for me apparently, but it's difficult for most people to get overly emotional about a pair of boots. But this is what he does with that type of technique. This is called At Eternity's Gate from 1890. And maybe from a distance or in a reproduction, you don't get, again, the full depth of the brushstrokes or the texture, which I think is what Van Gogh particularly brings to painting. But just to go in a bit, you can see the wall behind the man. It's like, it's almost Edvard Munch-like in the anguish. But there's a texture to the paint that contributes to the overall effect. And then, at risk of contradicting myself, I'm arguing that this has got texture. This is a watercolour called Sorrowful Old Man, which is obviously linked thematically, and this is 1882. So what I've tried to do to this point is just present very briefly some anime pictures and then contrast it with the type of visual art, at least, but I'd argue to some extent this also applies to literary art, the way in which traditional high art, whether visual or literary, contains nuances and depth that the product of mass culture like anime, even though some people, I think they're called the otaku in Japan, who are absolute experts in anything to do with manga or anime, they're obsessive collectors and people who study the format. So I'm not disputing or denying or making fun of or sneering at that people can get so invested in it. The question is, are there any implications as to people getting invested in things that have an aesthetic? No doubt about it, there is a unique aesthetic to anime and manga, but it's a completely different aesthetic to traditional art. And for some people, that's a wonderful thing, but I'm asking what might be the consequences for this different aesthetic. And one way I thought of looking at this is known as the Lacanian Triad, after the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan. And I won't go into a lot of depth, but I think the rudimentary aspects of it are enough for the purposes of this video. He argues that reality, as we normally refer to it, actually consists of these three elements: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real with a capital R. So reality with a small r refers to what we experience that is a combination of all these three things. And this, it's known as the shape, is known as the Borromean knot. And the idea is that these things in reality, as we experience it as human beings, are entangled, they're intertwined. So that's why it's a good representation. And what I'm going to argue is, just to define the terms before I do, the real, right, I'll do it, it would make more sense to say, the imaginary is like anime. It's about appearances, it's about surface level images. The symbolic is about language. It's about how, as a society and culture, we process images and how a culture provides context with which to understand those images. So I'm suggesting anime is more in the imaginary realm because it's highly stylized. It relies mostly upon hugely non-contextualized, non-linguistic, flat, rich-colored images. And the symbolic, as I've shown you with reference to Van Gogh and others, Monet, I'm suggesting they are more closely tied to tradition and culture and the anxiety of influence of different artists. Whereas, rather than a unique point in space and time, which is what aura refers to, so the example Walter Benjamin uses, who wrote The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction in 1935, where he uses this notion of aura, he says it's like being on a summer's day on a hillside, whatever, and you see the branch of a tree, and it's only you looking at that branch, the wind blowing through it, the sunlight at a certain angle. Only you at that point experience that aura, that unique point in space and time. And as I explained with the Monet painting, that also, you, if you're lucky enough to see it in person, you'll be the only, and it's a quiet gallery, fingers crossed, you might be the only person who's in front of it seeing its unique qualities and how it refracts the light and how Monet achieves this amazing effect. Whereas anime is any point in space, it's any point in space and time represented for any one screen. It's a decontextualized, idealized, I keep using the word, apologies, but flat image with none of the depth or complexity or links to previous artists. When I say that, I'm sure there are some subtleties, so I am simplifying, and in manga, I'm sure, and anime, they will refer to other, inverted commas, artists, but I'm, in a very old-fashioned way, suggesting that it could never be the same level of complexity or depth, at the risk of offending anime fans. So just remember, for the purposes of this video, I'm emphasizing that I think anime over relies upon this left-hand bottom side, the imaginary. Whereas what I am going to argue is good art involves the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real with a capital R. I've left it till last because it's the only real way of defining the real with a capital R is that it's what can't be defined by the imaginary or the symbolic. So just to repeat, the imaginary are images, appearances, idealized, simplified images. For example, if you think of a white, it's like the beginning, I'm trying to think of a good example. Blue Velvet, the David Lynch film, if you've ever seen that, it starts off with a white picket fence and this idealized portrayal of an American front garden. And I think at one point a big red fire truck goes by that's shiny as anything, and everyone's waving, the firemen are waving on the truck. That would be an imaginary portrayal of America. A symbolic portrayal might be the Stars and Stripes and or a novel that explored the concept of patriotism or the problems with America. And that is how through language, we filter our understanding of what America is, what Americans may be like. The real with a capital R is what's left over. And an example of that might be horror films tend to allude to the real. And I'd argue the most effective horror films are paradoxically those that show the least. So the Blair Witch Project springs to mind, where what it actually plot spoiler, but it's an old film now, you never really see what the scary thing is. The Alien films would be another example whereby I'd argue the Alien films are most effective when you didn't actually see the alien, when it was scurrying around the ship, and it's what you can't see but you fear. That's what has the most dramatic effect. I'm thinking of another example from art, but Edvard Munch's The Scream is a portrayal of the real, but it's basically the anguish that can't be fully expressed. Someone like Edvard Munch, the great artist that he was, probably came as close as is possible to expressing anguish through the famous painting, The Scream. But the real with a capital R in Lacanian Triad is what lies beneath that can't be fully expressed. And to give you an example, well, what's the relevance of this? I'm going to argue that, again, I want to get this crystal clear, so I'm sorry to repeat myself, but the imaginary, to me, is anime. The symbolic is language and art. And art will involve the imaginary, and it will involve the real, and it will involve the symbolic. So for me, good art will be this Borromean knot of all three. The imaginary obviously does draw upon the symbolic. Anime will have symbols within it, and anime will also allude to. So there's some dark themes in anime. But my personal opinion is that anime leans far too heavily and is far too reliant on the concept of the imaginary, whereas good art is much better at representing this Borromean knot of all three factors. And to give you, without rambling, to give you a specific example, this is Hans Holbein's painting The Ambassadors from 1533. Now, in terms of the imaginary, this is a picture of success, earthly power. You can tell this, so the imaginary elements that portray this overall depiction of power and wealth are obviously the expensive clothes. The artifacts on the tables show that these people can afford, stuff. They didn't get all that stuff from Amazon. And in the background, the richness of the curtain. So that would be the imaginary part of the Lacanian Triad. Now, just to give you a closer up. Now, the symbolic element of all this, it would be a video for another time. But on both levels, you can see various artifacts, and it's all to do with the top artifacts are all about science and the measurement of the globe and so on. The bottom layer is about, there's a lute with a broken string, and there's I think it's a prayer book, and apparently it's all to do with the Lutheran schism in the church, and the theme being developed in those symbols is the concept of division. But even if it wasn't, without getting into complexities of Lutheran schisms in the 16th century, there is obvious symbolism of the science type artifacts on the top shelf and the more musical, cultural on the bottom. So again, the imaginary is the overall, this at the most shallow level, this is successful, powerful people. Then there's a whole symbolic level, and believe me, you could, paper after paper has been written about the specifics of the Lutheran hints on the bottom shelf. And then this is what you see on the bottom. It's very clever. It's called anamorphosis. But just to go back, you see the skull at the very bottom. That's how it's painted. And apparently they restored it, and they think they might have screwed it up a bit because it was done so brilliantly that even the modern restorers couldn't quite work out how best to restore it. So I believe it's not quite what it would have been. Oh, sorry. But if you use a tube, that negates the effect of the anamorphosis or the distortion of the image, and you could see the skull. And in person, if you see it at the National Gallery in London, you have to go right to the side of the painting to see it at an oblique angle, and you'll see it more fully as a skull. And this is, if you get rid of the anamorphosis, this is the skull. So I just think this is a brilliant painting to illustrate how all three layers of the imaginary, the symbolic and the real, all interact. And the real, with a capital R in this case, is the skull. And if you've noticed in the left-hand side, there is a crucifix poking out from behind the curtain. So the crucifix and the skull at the bottom, they represent memento mori, or reminders of death. And that's, in this painting, what I describe as the real with a capital R. So the reality of that, the reality depicted in that painting is the worldly success of the two figures, the ambassadors. But beneath all that success is the thing that can't be fully described. It's the real capital R of death and mortality, and the thing that will come to get even these two incredibly powerful people. And like I say, the crucifix poking out in the corner. So, to try and draw all this together, in Aristotle's the Nicomachean Ethics, I think it was, they estimate he died in 322 BC, and I think they estimate it was written at the end of his life between 335 BC and his death in 322. And just one thing I want to pick out is the concept of phronesis, which a loose definition would be the notion of practical wisdom. And what I want to do now is all the things I've given you, artistic examples, aesthetic examples, and I want to relate this to philosophy and show you that I would suggest that what gives art, high art that draws upon centuries of tradition, is this concept of phronesis, practical wisdom. Whereas things like anime, or things what I'm suggesting are from what's known as the culture industry, and I'll refer to the German theorist Theodor Adorno very shortly, but the things that are given to us pre-made by the culture industry in a manufactured way lack this crucial quality. So I've mentioned the notion of aura, but this notion of phronesis, practical wisdom, I think is also relevant. So in terms of, in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, nous, which is, my mother always used the word nous, and it's a very Liverpool word, Liverpudlian word. But nous is defined as the direct intuitive apprehension of universal truths. So I'm giving you a simplified definition because it's much more complicated than I have time to develop at the moment, but it's almost the concept of a divine spark in humans. We have this divine instinct that tells us whether something's true or not. So it's this notion of a direct intuitive apprehension of that. Now, episteme is the scientific knowledge of universal principles. So I'd argue that is what's dominant in our society today. Whereas Aristotle, like the Greeks did with the concept of love, they had these various definitions. So agape, for example, in Greek is this religious notion of ecstasy, whereas in English we just have love. They had all these very subtle categories, which always is why it's such a, one of the reasons I'm going to argue it's such a shame we're losing touch with the classics, because in some ways they were so much more sophisticated in certain areas of culture than we are today. But this concept of scientific knowledge, universal principles, that is, science is the thing that everyone defers to these days. And techne, the original notion of techne was know-how in terms of skill or craft, but it could apply to, it's now been hijacked in our concept of technology. So we use the root techne to create the word technology. But in ancient Greek times, it would have much more to do with skills and crafts in general. Like, that could be art, or it could be something practical. And then you've got Sophia as the theoretical wisdom that combines nous and episteme. And then to cap all of this, you've got phronesis, practical wisdom. And this is what I wanted to focus on, phronesis, because I'm now going to jump into a discussion of Michael Oakeshott's work. But he doesn't actually use from memory the notion of phronesis, but I think it's basically what he's talking about. That's why I've done this preamble. Michael Oakeshott has this notion of practical wisdom, which he relates to tradition and custom, and it's the condensed wisdom of previous generations. And I think it relates to this notion of phronesis. It's the combination of all these types of wisdom but knowing when to use the right form of wisdom in a particular situation, that is what's referred to as phronesis. So he came out with this beautiful phrase, barbaric affluence. And in a book he had on human contact, and he developed these ideas, enterprise association, universitas. And he, in one essay he did 2 essays on the Tower of Babel. He used exactly the same title, the Tower of Babel, but they're 2 different essays. But in the first of those essays, he actually refers to the Tower of Babel being an example of an enterprise association which he was against. In other words, the people building the Tower of Babel wanted to come together and do this ridiculously large project. So he uses the phrase enterprise association. He said some societies, that's what they devote themselves to. So Mao's China or the Soviet Union, they were societies founded upon a belief in grand projects, both in terms of building huge, big projects, but also the belief that you could change human nature if you change the material conditions of human existence. Now, what Michael Oakeshott much preferred was this notion of civil association, societas. And this is where he links it to tradition, because for Michael Oakeshott, civil association refers to, I've used the phrase before, but I think it sums it up, the condensed wisdom of time. So there are certain ways of doing things that you internalize. Now, of course, that can be a bad thing if those ways are oppressive, but generally, a community will develop ways of doing things that have led to community cohesion over time. And legal conditions, I've written here, legal conditions of action are adverbial. What I mean by that is they try and make laws that are guidance orientated rather than incredibly prescriptive. So, for example, rather than have some hugely idealized code that you refer to and should be applied at all times, the laws that they do have in a civil association are much more geared towards the concept of, very specifically, to give you a very practical example, killing. Rather than say killing is not permissible in any circumstances, which might be the basis of a very coherent but quite intrusive legal system where nobody's allowed to kill anybody. Whereas if you're allowed to kill someone, but the law is you're not allowed to kill murderously, this is where the concept of the adverbial comes in. Or you are allowed to kill defensively. These caveats that are provided by adverbs are what introduces the common sense elements of traditional ways of doing things. So against that, you have things like the Napoleonic Code. Napoleon and arguably other dictatorial leaders had a very legalistic, prescriptive and proscriptive attitude to how they wanted to dominate their subjects. Whereas for Oakeshott, this civil association is much more organic. It's much less pro and prescriptive. It leaves more room because it's not thou shalt not all the time. It's much more these are the generally agreed constraints under which you can operate. And so yes, you can kill someone in the right circumstances. It's just a lot more responsive. And what this all leads to is, it's in Oakeshott's work, he did another book called The Politics of Faith and the Politics of Skepticism. And I think it's hugely relevant to today. And this links to art because the Enterprise Association, because it's so rule-bound and because it's so systematic, so think of the Soviet Union, think of Mao's China, the Little Red Book. These rules are all written down and have to be obeyed at all costs. The civil association is much more, as I keep saying, based upon tradition and evolves organically. Well, that relates to good art doesn't flourish in places like the Soviet Union if you're told this is the only art you can produce. Or Mao's China is it bourgeois art that goes against Mao's Little Red Book? Whereas if art's based upon the response, this anxiety of influence, and it's not dictated to by authority above you, that's what he calls the politics of skepticism. And I'd argue the politics of skepticism allows, and there's a mutual symbiosis. Good art feeds the politics of skepticism, and the politics of skepticism allows good art. The politics of faith is this belief in rigid dogma, and I'd suggest that is what it dominates today. People who are ideologically captured, who believe so strongly in certain eternal truths without any nuance, without any deviation. There's no real discussion. Now, this all relates to art and back to anime, because politics of faith encourages a technical approach to knowledge, whereas according to Oakeshott, a practical approach to knowledge is when you have phronesis, when you have the combination of knowing when to use knowledge and having wisdom and intuition and technical knowledge. All of these things are combined. Like previously I said, the Lacanian Triad of the real, the imaginary and the symbolic in good art are all naturally combined and reflected in the piece of art. Likewise, wise society draws upon its tradition. It doesn't cut itself off from that tradition. And its customs and its traditions will inform its art and be informed by that art. And one of the questions regarding anime is, to what extent is it tradition-less because of this flatness of effect, because of its idealized, its overemphasis upon idealized aesthetics. But Oakeshott isn't very popular. I think I'm trying to slightly give him a bit more exposure. There was this very catty, I love the way academics can be quite catty. This George Catlin commented that Oakeshott's political theory was about contemporary with Noah, that great navigator in the vastly general. And I'd argue that's a typically technocratic response to what Oakeshott was trying to argue. Oakeshott's arguing against technical, specific knowledge and arguing in favour of intuition, connoisseurship, mastery, all these amorphous things that's being dismissed here as vastly general. But Oakeshott, I think he had this view on media discourse, which I think is beautiful. Just to give a taste of his type of language. The barking of a dog at the echo of its own yelp. That's brilliant. And if you watch programs like in America, like The View, the circularity of the imbecilic, bovine utterances of certain programs, or the whole media news cycle, the trivial nature of most of the stories, the obsession with the celebrities involved or the personalities rather than actual policy. So with regards to practical knowledge, this is knowledge that could be described as traditional knowledge and exists only in use. Practical knowledge is not susceptible to precise formulation. It's expressed in a customary or traditional way of doing things, or simply in practice. It can neither be taught or learned, but only imparted and acquired by apprenticeship to a master. The practical knowledge Oakeshott variously describes as artistry, connoisseurship, style and judgment, and the technical form of knowledge which can be taught and learned in the simplest meanings of those words. They are distinct forms of knowledge, but they are completely inseparable. So Oakeshott was never dismissing technical knowledge. It's important, but it's the way in which technical knowledge has swamped all of the forms of knowledge that I think he would object to. The technical can be taught. It lies in manuals, in written rules and regulations, can be demonstrated physically. Practical knowledge, however, can only be imparted and acquired. It exists only in practice, and the only way to acquire it is by apprenticeship to a master. Rationalism, asserted Oakeshott, contains at bottom an epistemological fallacy, which is the belief only in technical knowledge. Practical knowledge is seen as nonsensical or fallacious. If reason is the only supremacy, then technique is supreme. To rationalist thought, technical knowledge begins in absolute ignorance and ends in certainty. So now I'm going to look at the cultural, social consequences of this obsession with technical knowledge and the ability to react against it. So I have referred in previous videos to Bartleby the Scrivener by Herman Melville, and it's a beautiful short story about a clerk in an office who tries to resist this huge technical structure he's having to operate within by his catchphrase, "I prefer not to." And by the end of the short story, he just wastes away, he just gives up the ghost. But this practical knowledge is seen as nonsensical or fallacious. Remember, Oakeshott's using the phrase practical knowledge not like DIY or not like technical knowledge. Practical knowledge also includes the arts and more abstract notions of wisdom, as I laid them out in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. But again, just to relate to today's ideologically riven and driven times, technical knowledge begins in absolute ignorance and ends in certainty. Everyone is so certain about their point of view these days. Now, I'm just going to start wrapping things up by referring to, there's a great German theorist, Theodor Adorno, who is so miserable. I love him. And he describes, by reference to something called the culture industry, how when culture itself is captured by this technical mentality, he describes how difficult it is to genuinely resist it. So here's this practical image. These were this is a picture from 1948 from the Trocadero in Sydney, Australia, and they're jitterbug dancers. So it was a form of dancing, gets its name from, it's almost insect-like in the jerking. And it reminds me, I think, is it Once in a Lifetime by David Byrne, Talking Heads? He has this weird dance that he does that I think isn't too dissimilar to the theme that Adorno's addressing. But Adorno's basically, he mentions jitterbug dancers. And he mentions various different types of people, like jazz people who think they're being different by doing things that seem to be relatively extreme or anti-establishment or unusual. So this isn't a waltz. Of the time, this was quite on the edge and radical. But interestingly, Adorno argues that this isn't threatening the system at all. And in fact, it's part of technical knowledge's grasp upon society. So the opposite type to jitterbugs appears to be the eager person who leaves the factory. I'll come back to why jitterbugs, and I'll use the example of goths later on, for example, why opposition doesn't really work when a society is completely dominated by a technical attitude. The opposite type to jitterbugs appears to be the eager person who leaves the factory and occupies himself with music in the quiet of his bedroom. He's shy and inhibited, perhaps has no luck with girls, and wants in any case to preserve his own special sphere. He seeks this as a radio ham. At 20, he's still at the stage of a Boy Scout working on complicated knots just to please his parents. This type is held in high esteem in radio matters. He patiently builds sets whose important parts he must buy ready-made and scans the air for shortwave secrets, though there are none. So this is from 1938, his essay Fetish, Character, Music and Regression of Listening, which at a future date might be interesting, because I'm not an expert on music by any means. But for those of you who are interested in music, it's a stunning piece of work. And I've put a link in the description box to the full essay. So if there's any interest in me going into more depth, please do shout out. But given that this is 1938, so, 85 odd years ago, 87 I should say, but it's quite prescient. Obviously the technology he's talking about, radio hams, it's very basic compared to now, but he's pointing out that, because I did research on computer hackers, it's this idea that you think you're working on the edge opposing the system, when in fact you're the equivalent of a 20-year-old Boy Scout working on complicated knots. And this is, what a mullet. But this is, I remember the early 1980s, I had a friend who had a radio set like this and a huge big antennae in his back garden in Liverpool. And this is how quickly things change. We just take for granted that on the internet you can communicate with people from across the globe. But in those days, this was as close as you could get to that. And it was amazing that you could do it. But it's just, in 40 years, this has become quaint and incredibly old-fashioned, but at the time, this was amazing. Adorno develops the point. As a reader of Indian stories and travel books, I think he means cowboys and Indian-type stories, he once discovered unknown lands and cleared his path through the forest primeval. As radio ham, he becomes the discoverer of just those industrial products which are interested in being discovered by him. He brings nothing home which would not be delivered to his house. The adventurers of pseudo-activity have already organised themselves on a large scale. The radio amateurs have printed verification cards sent them by the shortwave stations they have discovered, and hold contests in which the winner is the one who can produce the most such cards. So he's scathing about how this type of obsessive behaviour. So if I ever get to talk about in future the otaku, the Japanese people obsessed by anime and manga, and incredibly knowledgeable, Adorno's pointing out that I've emboldened it. He brings home nothing which would not be delivered to his house. So you're completely dependent upon the system that gives you these products. He becomes the discoverer of just those industrial products which are interested in being discovered by him. So there's no oppositional quality to any of this. You're parasitical upon what the system gives you. Of all fetishistic listeners, the radio ham is perhaps the most complete. It is irrelevant to him what he hears or even how he hears. He is only interested in the fact that he hears and succeeds in inserting himself with his private equipment into the public mechanism without exerting even the slightest influence on it. So this, I've emphasized this, and apologies if this seems not particularly relevant to all the previous things I've been talking about, but I actually think this gets to the crux of those who see things like anime as a genuine aesthetic pursuit, when, if you follow Adorno's line of reasoning, what actually things like anime represent are people becoming invested in things that are controlled by a system that produces these things. Whereas high art, even when the establishment thinks it owns it, it's simply not possible for the establishment to own the full complexity of a Shakespeare play. And there's lots in Shakespeare plays you could use as a resource to critique the establishment, to critique the status quo, and to find oppositional value. Whereas Adorno's pointing out the extent to which, in modern technologically drenched society, of which anime is a clear example, the people invested in anime are of this type. They're fetishistic. It's the act, it's the process of being obsessed that's more important than the actual value of the thing that they're obsessed by. So another example would be the jazz aficionado. He shines by a capacity for rough improvisations, even if he must practice the piano for hours in secret in order to bring the refractory rhythms together. He pictures himself as the individualist who whistles at the world, but what he whistles is its melody, and his tricks are less inventions of the moment than stored up experiences from acquaintance with sought-after technical things. His improvisations are always gestures of nimble subordination to what the instrument demands of him. So this, I remember, in a university sector, if you ever mentioned Adorno, this was all most people knew about Adorno, was he didn't like jazz. And he was an odd fish, Adorno, because he really did like Schoenberg. Excuse me. And if you've heard the atonal horror that is Schoenberg, it's the real with a capital R in musical form. So I really don't share Adorno's taste in music, and I don't think Adorno would have liked Barry White like I do. But he makes the interesting point here that the jazz aficionado thinks they're being oppositional. They think they're wearing black polo necks and smoking cigars and being cool, speaking jazz-type lingo of the time he's writing, when in fact, he, again, like the radio ham, he's only making of things what is given to him that can be controlled ultimately by other people. His tricks are less inventions of the moment than stored up experiences from acquaintance with sought-after technical things. So this goes to the root of Oakeshott's complaint that technical knowledge has overtaken society. Adorno is agreeing with that point, even though Adorno and Oakeshott's politics are radically different. But this idea that the people who think they're being oppositional, I could pick on any, like, bikers or heavy metal people who wear, like, a heavy metal uniform. But these are goths in Whitby in the UK. I think Whitby in the UK is a goth central because of the Bram Stoker links. The whole notion of Dracula coming into Whitby Bay. But the idea that by being oppositional, by being different, by being unique, you all wear the same uniform never ceases to amuse me. The chauffeur is the model for the listening type of the clever fellow. His agreement with everything dominant goes so far that he no longer produces any resistance, but of his own accord always does what is asked of him for the sake of the responsible functionary. He lies to himself about the completeness of his subordination to the rule of the reified mechanism, in other words, the culture industry, Thus, the sovereign routine of the jazz amateur is nothing but the passive capacity for adaptation to models from which to avoid straying. He is the real jazz subject. His improvisations come from the pattern, and he navigates the pattern, cigarette in mouth, as nonchalantly as if he had invented it himself. So I've just shown this because I just think it's a beautiful way of describing basically false consciousness of thinking that you're being oppositional, thinking that you've got artistic integrity when actually you're demonstrating technical type of knowledge rather than genuine artistic knowledge or artistic wisdom. And to bring it full circle back to the anime to conclude, my slightly provocative point would be to fans of anime is that this may seem vaguely oppositional. It's some like complaint about the way in which the system turns people into shut-ins, or it's a way of making the best of a culture industry that is quite isolating. So you're enjoying a product, and that this is back to the Adorno. To what extent can you be genuinely freeing yourself from subordination to a system if you're expressing yourself through what's given to you by that system? And in lots of ways, I'd argue anime partakes of the system that produced it. And to back that up, I go back to this distinction I'd make. So this is a depiction of hikikomori, a shut-in. But this is what Vincent van Gogh did with a similar theme of imprisonment, of isolation, of being forcibly withdrawn from society. So this is Prisoners Exercising, 1890. And this goes back to my point about, remember there's this, but there's also way back near the beginning, I showed a picture of an angst-ridden face of this guy from the NHK series. And this is my point about the clear lines and the imaginary. This is what I mean by it's an idealized form. The face is clearly drawn. The face is looking directly at you. It's clear, but also somewhat empty and, I would suggest, of limited effect, or affect, A-double-F-E-C-T. Whereas one of the ironies of high art, good art, to use a very traditional phallocentric, patriarchal, stale pale male phrase, it's the lack of detail on these faces looking back at you. In Van Gogh's case, less is more. And to provide a final illustration of that, this is from an anime series called Tower of God. And don't ask me, but the thing hanging in the sky apparently is an alien observation platform. Wouldn't you know? I'm becoming cynical. I've tried to be neutral towards anime, and I think I've wound myself up as we've gone along. But I'll just conclude by, if you have this in your mind, I'm hoping the final slide I show you brings together what I'm arguing is the difference between this type of aesthetic form and what art drawing upon centuries of influence, the anxiety of influence. And in Van Gogh's case, anxiety is a very apposite word. But it's almost, to me, it's palpable, the difference between this and what I would call true art that doesn't suffer from the barbarity of affluence. So I'll leave you this last image to contrast with this. Until the next time, all the very best. Take care.